T24 Haber Merkezi'nden iyi akşamlar. Bu akşam konuğumuz ABD Başkanı Donald Trump'ın eski ulusal güvenlik danışmanı John Bolton. Bolton görevden ayrıldıktan sonra yazdığı The Room Where It Happened kitabıyla dünyanın birçok yerinde manşetlerde kendine yer buldu. Bu akşam da bize ABD Başkanı Donald Trump'la Cumhurbaşkanı Erdoğan arasındaki ilişkilerden, Ankara-Washington hattında onun da görevde olduğu sırada zaman zaman çok gergin seyreden ilişkilerden, ABD'nin dış politikasından, aynı zamanda Biden'ın seçimleri kazanması durumunda Beyaz Saray'ın Türkiye'ye yönelik nasıl bir politika izleyebileceğinden bahsedecek. Hello Ambassador Bolton, I hope you're doing fine today.
I am, and you too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a question about President Erdogan and President Trump. So we know that they had a lot of contact during their time in their presidency in Trump's past 3 years. So can you tell us a little bit about the relationship with Erdogan and Trump between them? And this week, President Trump has claimed that Erdogan listens to him. Can you expand on this claim a little bit?
Well, I can tell you about the 17 months that I spent in the White House, and I've described that in my book, In the Room Where It Happened. The relationship was in difficult shape when I started because of the incarceration of Pastor Bronson, who we thought had been detained without any cause whatever. He's a minister. He's been in Turkey many years. He was accused of involvement in with Fethullah Gülen. We thought that was preposterous. And we felt that it was important that he be released as soon as possible. Erdogan was not inclined to do that, and so we imposed sanctions on Turkey. It had a devastating effect on the currency, and conversations between Trump and Erdogan during that period were very unhappy, as you might imagine. Now, when Erdogan, and I think it's clear, he made a decision that Brunson be released, things picked up again. And the conversations that Trump and Erdogan had thereafter on Syria, primarily on Syria, I think from Erdogan's point of view went very well. He wanted the U.S. and the coalition forces to withdraw from Syria. And Trump said on a number of occasions he agreed with that. That was not the view of other members of the coalition or other advisors within the Trump administration. And Trump modified his views. He heard in the U.S., he heard from many people who supported the Kurds and the role they had played in the defeat of the ISIS territorial caliphate. He heard from American voters, perhaps they were Kurds, but who said, the Kurds were with us in the fight against ISIS and we can't abandon them. So the relationship over Syria, the concern about a Syrian attack into Idlib province and the devastation that could cause, 500,000 to 1 million refugees perhaps fleeing Idlib into Turkey. All of these various aspects of Syria predominated in the conversation. Now, Erdogan had his own agenda too, stopping the prosecution of Halkbank in federal court in New York and some other things like that were much more problematic. But that's basically a quick description of how it went during my tenure.
Okay, so in your book, you mentioned that President Erdogan has accepted, President Trump has accepted to intervene into the Halkbank case. Now we know that this would have, if it ever got out as it did, it would have effects on Trump's election, on his diplomacy chances. So why did President Trump accept to intervene to this case? What was his reasoning behind it?
Well, he seemed persuaded by Erdogan that Halkbank was being treated unfairly. Now, in fact, my own review, and I think the position of our Department of Justice, was that Halkbank had massively violated U.S. sanctions against Iran, number one, and number two, had lied about it. In other words, committing financial fraud, so that it was perfectly appropriate to pursue them criminally and to seek very severe penalties. If this had been an American bank, that had done this, we would have, as we say in the United States, thrown the book at them. So Halkbank was not being treated unfairly. What Erdogan was asking for was special treatment for a foreign bank. And it was mystifying, I think, to Trump's senior advisors why he gave that any credence at all, why he seemed to want to try and do Erdogan a favor. When Bill Barr came in as the new Attorney General, Trump asked him to look into it. I won't go into all the details, and it's a long story, but ultimately the Department of Justice decided to continue the prosecution, and that's basically where we stand now.
And I would like to continue about what you tell in your memoir. So in your memoir, which made the headlines in all over the world, that you said the sentence was that President Trump is giving favors to dictators he likes. Can you expand on this a little bit?
Well, if you look at the history of the conversation between Trump and Zelensky in Ukraine, Zelensky's not an authoritarian figure; he was democratically elected, but he was asking for help in a U.S. election by Ukraine launching an investigation. That was one example. Dealing with China on Huawei and ZTE and other matters. The conversations that Trump had with Putin on Russian interference in U.S. elections. So there were a whole series of these conversations with foreign leaders where Trump seemed to be prepared to give away American law enforcement interest without getting anything in return. Now, the president in our system is the chief executive. He's got responsibility both for prosecution of criminal offenses and for foreign affairs. There's sometimes conflicts, there's no doubt about it, and it's the president's decision. But a responsible president makes decisions that involve trade-offs that sometimes have to be made between law enforcement and foreign policy. It's not a question of giving away something to a foreign leader in hopes of getting something in return.
Okay, so there was a bipartisan effort to put sanctions on Turkey after Ankara's purchase of S-400 defense systems from Russia. And there were other efforts to put sanctions on Turkey, like after operations on the north in Syria. Did President Trump make efforts to stop this sanctions being put on Turkey?
Yes, I think you can see that. There have been no sanctions on the S-400. Despite it being, I think, a very clear violation of American law for us not to put the sanctions on. The S-400 is obviously incompatible with NATO air defenses, so it provided no extra benefit for the alliance. And in fact, it endangered the F-35 to have it in proximity to a Russian air defense system that might have compromised its stealth technology. So that eliminated Turkey from the F-35 program, which was unfortunate for everybody involved. And at some point, people in Congress will push for the sanctions to be applied to Turkey, which is also unfortunate. We couldn't understand why Erdogan seemed to be so intent on taking steps that would edge Turkey away from NATO. Why he would want to weaken Turkey's ties with the NATO alliance, and why he would want to put Turkey on a path to bring it closer to Russia. It's very hard to understand that kind of behavior in a NATO member country.
And so we talked about Erdogan and Trump having a lot of contact in their joint time in the office. But however, there was despite heavy evidence that Fethullah Gülen has organized the 15th of July coup attempt, U.S. has not extradited them. What was Trump's reasoning behind this?
Well, I don't think he was involved in that decision. I mean, in several conversations, Erdogan and his advisors said they would send evidence of Gülen's complicity in coup efforts and other plots against the Erdogan government. And they did supply material. It was often the same material supplied several times. It was reviewed by officials at the Department of Justice who would look into the consideration of a possible request for extradition. There are requirements under extradition treaties that have to be met before we extradite people to their countries and vice versa. And they felt after several reviews of the evidence that Turkey had submitted that there just wasn't enough there to consider sending Fethullah Gülen back. So that never happened. But I think that was basically a Department of Justice decision.
Okay, so contrary to situation in Syria, we have seen Trump being pretty silent on topic of the Libyan civil war. What was President Trump's stance on Libyan civil war, and has it changed throughout time?
Well, I don't think he focused on it that much. He certainly heard a lot from President el-Sisi of Egypt for the Egyptians' obvious concern about the instability, the civil war in Libya, right on Egypt's western border. Egypt was obviously a supporter of General Haftar and made the case several times that Haftar was the only Libyan figure who could bring unity and stability to the country. It was also the case that Haftar was being aided by the Russians. This was a big concern to me because we didn't want to see yet additional Russian interference in the Middle East or North Africa. They were already deeply involved in the Syrian conflict, and now they were involved in a conflict in Libya. Nor did we want to see Libya turned into a place where surrogate forces backed by Turkey and Qatar in one place, and Egypt and other Gulf states and Russia in another. But it was not an area where Trump spent a lot of time or energy or focus.
Okay, so in the future that US is going to have an election on September 3rd of this year, and polls are showing that there's a good chance that Trump might lose the White House. So before you worked as a national security advisor, you also worked a long time in policymaking, in other governmental roles and diplomatic roles. So I would want to ask you, what kind of a policy Biden would follow if he wins towards Turkey?
Well, it's hard to say. Biden has the election, by the way, is November the 3rd, and so a little bit more than 2 months away. Biden has done his best in the campaign not to articulate a lot of specific positions, and this is often what a challenger does. He tries to make the election about the incumbent and why the incumbent has failed. I do think that over the years, Biden has been a very strong supporter of NATO. I think he believes the alliance is important to the United States and important to Europe. So I think he would be concerned about any steps that tended to undercut the alliance. But it's I think it's in an election campaign, the opposition party often says things about how tough it will be until it gets into office, and then they turn around. So I'm not confident internationally that people really have a good fix on what Biden may do.
Okay, and as my last question, I would like to ask, during your time, what was President Trump's view towards Turkey? What did he think Turkey's role was in Middle East and in the grander scheme, the world diplomatic view?
Well, I think he obviously saw the implications of Turkey's role in Syria in a number of respects. And that, as I said, that was the subject probably of most of the conversations between Trump and Erdogan. I think his focus on many of the other problems of the Middle East with Iran and the threat posed by their nuclear weapons program, their support for terrorism, and their conventional activity in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere was probably a bigger focus. And then with respect to the continuing issue of Israel, the Palestinians, and what to do there, he focused heavily on the Gulf Arab states. And we've seen one reflection of that in the recognition of Israel, likely from the United Arab Emirates, the exchange of full diplomatic relations. So this was something that there were a lot of issues that Turkey was involved in, but it's not Trump's manner to see things in a comprehensive strategic way. He treats these issues in an ad hoc, individual fashion, and I think that was reflected frequently in his dealings with Turkey.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering our questions, Ambassador, and have a good rest of your day.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.